All right, so it's 8:30. We should get started on this rainy morning here in Calgary. Welcome to the Fireside Breakfast Chat with Dr. Evelyn Forget. We're so excited. I am Meaghon Reid. I'm the Executive Director at Vibrant Communities Calgary, and we are the stewards of the Enough for All Poverty Reduction Strategy, which is sort of owned by everybody in our community. And basic income is definitely one of the major levers that we highlight in terms of being able to reduce poverty for the long term in our city and in our country. We are proud to host this event as part of the TEDxYYC Reimagine event, and we hope that everyone can stay for the day. I would like to acknowledge and honor all of those who live in Calgary, or as we say in Mohkinstsis and Blackfoot, and who make our homes in the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy of Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge the Métis peoples and the Métis Region 3, as well as the settlers who call this land home in southern Alberta. I've been finding land acknowledgements challenging, particularly, again, with more discoveries in Cowessess First Nation that were announced yesterday. And we at Vibrant Communities Calgary, and I know everyone here, are feeling that profound sadness at the magnitude of this loss and grief that many of those children would have been able to join us maybe today as an elder. And so we're missing that wisdom. And we want to hold space for that wisdom as we continue in our day and in all of our work as well. We are so honored that Dr. Evelyn Forget is joining us today to talk about basic income as part of our strategy and as part of Basic Income Alberta's strategy, if you are joining from that group here today. The discussion will be for about 45 minutes with questions and answers from the group. And I can see that most of you have also found the chat, which is amazing. You can enter your questions or comments in the chat as well, and those will be moderated. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lee Stevens. Lee is the Policy and Research Specialist at Vibrant Communities Calgary. During her career as a social worker, Lee has worked in homeless and housing sector at organizations such as the Calgary Drop-In Center, CUPS, and Alberta Health Services. Lee champions many social causes and aimed at ending poverty and creating equal opportunities, but none more vigorously than basic income. When we sort of came into the pandemic, I think we were all just watching basic income hum in the background. And then all of a sudden we saw this opportunity I don't think any of us thought we would have for a while. And Lee really took the reins on that. So I am so excited to hand it over to Lee.
Thanks, Meaghon, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce Dr. Evelyn Forget. She's a professor of economics and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. Her research investigates the social determinants of health, the health effects of social policy, and more specifically, and why she's here today, basic income. She is the author for Basic Income for Canadians, From the COVID-19 Emergency to Financial Security for All. She's often called upon by governments, First Nations, and international organizations to advise on poverty, inequality, health, and social outcomes. And we're so honored to have her here today. Welcome, Evelyn.
Thank you, Lee. I'm delighted to be here. I'm joining you from Winnipeg, from Treaty 1 territory.
Thank you. Before maybe we launch into the questions, I want to ask, how are you doing and what has the last year and a half been like for you? Because you seem to be everywhere.
I do. I feel like I'm everywhere. I think this is a really interesting time to be talking about basic income. I think the pandemic's really awakened us to a lot of the inequalities that existed before, and a lot of people are recognizing that we're not quite sure we want to go back to where we were. And the question is how we can do it better. And so, yeah, basic income is certainly having a moment.
It's very exciting for us. This is a window, and we don't know how long the window is going to be open. So yeah. I think you know that, which is why, I think we try to take every opportunity to talk about basic income, whether it's lunch and learns or just showing up at a meeting and speaking about what we know and myth busting. And I see that you're kind of on the same train as that. Yeah. So we've gotten a few questions ahead of time. I'm going to start out with talking about what measures do we need to consider when deciding on the amounts of the basic income benefit. There are lots of measures of poverty. So what do we need to consider when we're talking about how much people could get?
I think we have to be careful not to imagine that there's some magic number out there, and that if people are above that number, they're doing fine, and if they're below that number, they're living in poverty. Anytime we talk about social programs, we're always making political and social decisions. But I mean, I think one way to approach it is to think about some of the other social programs that we've already got in place. And one of the things that's happened, of course, during the pandemic is that I think the government, either the federal government, either intentionally or unintentionally, set a new benchmark with the $2,000 a month strategy under the CERB. And I don't think that's what they had in mind when they set that, but certainly people are asking whether $2,000 a month is the new norm of what it costs to actually live a reasonable and decent life in Canada. Before that, I think we were looking at other social programs. When Ontario ran its basic income guarantee experiment, I was going to say, when Ontario ran its basic income guarantee experiment, they were looking to the amount that we expect seniors to live on if they have access to no private resources between the OAS and the GIS, and they were looking at that number, which is about $17,000 or $18,000 for individuals. So I think somewhere between those two norms is what people are looking at as a basic guarantee.
Absolutely. And when we look at the market basket measure, the $2,000 a month is very close to the market basket measure, which just happens to be the official poverty line. So
Exactly.
I'm sure they had that conversation when they were deciding on the CERB amount. You have to wonder. How do you envision a basic income would impact people already on disability benefits like AISH here in Alberta?
Well, AISH is a wonderful example, and I'm glad you asked that, because I think one of the criticisms that basic income advocates often get is that if we introduce a basic income, it's going to hurt people on disability. And I certainly don't know any basic income advocate who would like to take any benefits away. So I think it's important to think about those programs and think about how a basic income would impact them. If you think about the AISH, for example, or any disability program, any provincial disability program, it really consists of two parts. On the one hand, there's income replacement, the amount of money you get every month to pay the rent and put food on the table and clothes on your back. And then there are a lot of other benefits that tend to be tied to it, things like special supports for people with disabilities. And I think that one of the things that we have to look very, very seriously at as we move forward is delinking those two programs. If people have a disability, if they have particular needs, they ought to be able to access those special programs, whether or not they're receiving income replacement through a disability program. So if you think about somebody in the workforce, for example, somebody who's working, if they have a disability, they ought to be able to access those resources.
Right.
So if we delink those two programs and then only look at the income replacement part, AISH is really a nice example of what a basic income might look like. The level of payment is actually quite close to the $2,000 a month. It treats earned income in a much better way than most provincial income assistance programs do. There's a large allowance before your benefit starts being reduced, and then when it is reduced, it's reduced very gradually. You can amass assets, you can save money, you can invest money on the program without losing your benefit. If you receive a gift from a family member, your benefits aren't cut, as they are in many provinces on income assistance. So it's actually a very nice program. And so in some ways, I think what we'd be looking at is trying to extend the kind of program that exists for people on AISH to everybody who needs it, everybody whose income is low enough to qualify for support.
Absolutely. I think we're on the road to income support with programs like AISH, and basic income is like that last mile.
It is. It's the hardest part, because if you think about it, we have a basic income for families with kids under 18. The Canada Child Benefit is a basic income. We have a basic income for people over 65 between the OAS and the GIS. We have a basic income, at least Alberta has a basic income in AISH for people with disabilities. And I think other provinces are looking at doing something similar. The hardest part, of course, are working age adults. And those are the people who tend to get left behind. And I think that's where the greatest need really is in society right now.
And that's where the deserving, undeserving dichotomy comes into play, right? If you're able to work, then you don't deserve. And that's just something that people have a really hard time getting over. Yeah. That's
right. And I think one of the things that, you know, I think that there are a lot of challenges for us when we start thinking about that. One of the things we have to do as a society, I think, is to cast our mind a little more broadly when we think about work. You know, work is not just working for a paycheck, working in a factory, working in the paid labor market. Work also includes all of the important things that let our society keep functioning. Things like creative activity, artists, it includes caregiving work, it includes all of those other things, volunteer work, all of the important things that make a society function, and without which a society won't function. So I think that one of the things we have to do is to ask ourselves, how important is it that we drive people into the workforce and force them to do a certain kind of thing if there's another contribution they can be making?
I think that's the right word to use. That's the word I use, is it's a contribution to society. And, you know, we do a lot of advocating for income assistance reform. And I wish that they kept track of the volunteer work that people do when they're on income support, because that's a contribution that's not being tracked. And from my experience as a social worker, a lot of people on income support are busy all day volunteering, helping their friends, helping their family, helping their neighbors. I had one person told me they received too much money from their good food box. They received, too much food from their good food box order, and they hopped on the city bus and spent 3 hours dropping off the extra food to their friends who they thought needed it. And, you know, just going above and beyond, you know, that sort of thing, that is a contribution to society that is going untracked, and they're barely making ends meet, but they're helping out their community. They're trying to make the community a better place. So,
and I think it also gives people the time to work on social change. People with a basic income have the time to participate in social movements and to fight for changes in some of the deeper injustices that exist in society.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm just dying to ask you, what was your reaction to the BC report?
Well, on the one hand, I think we have to remember that this is a provincial report, and I think most provinces in Canada certainly don't believe themselves to have the fiscal capacity to offer a full basic income. So they're limited. I mean, a province can't change federal tax policy, for example. So in some ways, I guess I wasn't surprised. Some of the recommendations they made for reforms are good recommendations.
Yeah.
I think my biggest disappointment was that it seems to be based on the premise that most of the programs we have are pretty good, and all we need to do is to tweak them. And I think that the biggest limitation of the existing programs we have is that they would like to put us all into little boxes, to design particular programs for particular groups of people. And they perpetuate that view of the way social programs should work, and in fact, push it even further. When I think about, well, my students are a good example. I teach at a university. My post-secondary students are also parents. Some of them are single parents. Many of them are working 2 and 3 jobs. Some of them are working precariously. Many of them have disabilities. It's not so easy to say these people are disabled, they need this program. These people are leaving a violent relationship and they need this program. These people, you know, are low-income workers. we're all many things. Certainly over our lifetimes, we fit into different boxes, but at any point in time, we're different. We fit into different boxes. And I think that one of the advantages of a basic income over the way we've done social policy in the past is it recognizes that, the one fundamental thing everybody needs is enough money to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, and clothes on their backs.
Yeah.
Once you do that, then you can start looking at particular programs to layer over top to meet particular needs. But we need that fundamental guarantee.
I agree. I think that they made a lot of good points, and there was a lot of good recommendations in the paper, but they came to the wrong conclusion.
Yeah.
Is how I felt about it. And when you talk about targeting so much all of the social programs, they do the same thing in housing that always irks me. Particular building is for single moms, and then there's another building for families, and then there's another type of housing for singles, and then they don't realize that people change throughout their life. You might be single at one point in your life, but then you might be a couple, and then you might be a family, and then you might go back to being single, and you shouldn't have to move every time that happens.
Well, actually, let me tell you about a program that I'm very proud of that we have in Manitoba, and we've had since 2014. It's called Rent Assist. And it's more than a portable housing benefit. Rent Assist is actually a small basic income, right? It's the amount of money it's available to people in the workforce, people who aren't working. It's available to everybody based solely on your income. The amount of money you receive depends on the median price of housing. So whatever the rent is for an apartment and the amount of money you receive, the difference between the two. But you don't have to produce receipts. In fact, you don't have to use the money to rent an apartment. If you want to, spend the money on whatever you want. Once you get the money, it's yours to make the decision. So they avoided the very dangerous term basic income, which I think is politically challenging. But it's a very nice program, and it's within the capacity of, Manitoba's a have-not province. It's within the capacity of any province to offer something like that. It's too little to live on. It's too little to replace income assistance, but it certainly is a help. And so I think that there are many things they could have done in that report that would have moved things forward.
Yeah, it's a step towards a basic income. Another one. Okay, let's talk about wages. I get this question a lot about how a basic income would impact wages, and what has been the reaction of unions and labor groups because of this?
Well, let me answer the second part first. I've been really gratified over the past year to see the number of labor advocates who are coming on board with basic income. The Steelworkers Union.
Yes, I was just thinking
to see that in PEI, where there's an all-party agreement to implement a basic income. They would like very much to have a basic income.
Yes.
CUPE, which represents government workers, is on board. They're very supportive of the idea of a basic income. So I think that there's quite a lot of union support. It's been slow in coming, but I think that there's a growing recognition that basic income, to the extent that it has an effect on wages at all, is going to enhance those wages. And if you think about it, Andy Stern, who's an American labor organizer, argues that basic income is a permanent strike fund. It gives workers the opportunity to walk away from demeaning and dangerous work. And to some extent, I think we saw that with the CERB. We saw people refusing to work in meatpacking plants in Western Canada, for example. Not so much because the wages were low, but because their employers couldn't keep them safe. If they had access to the CERB, they weren't forced to undertake those kinds of jobs. So I think one thing a basic income will do is to put a little bit of pressure on low-wage exploitative employers and ask them to clean their act up a little bit. So to the extent that it has an effect at all, it's going to be a positive effect on wages. It's consistent with higher wages. I know that, I keep coming across critics of basic income who argue that it lets employers off the hook and employers would reduce wages, but there's no logic behind that. That just makes no sense at all.
Can you explain a little bit about the difference between how the CERB was designed compared to how we would design a basic income, that earning exemption rate? Because with CERB, if you earned more than $1,000, you lost the CERB completely.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about how that impacted people trying to go back to work while on the CERB? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be very, very foolish to accept a job that made you lose your entire benefit. I think that one of the key features of the basic income is that there's a very gradual phase out as your earnings increase.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea behind a guaranteed income, for example, is that for every dollar you earn, your benefit is reduced by some portion significantly less than $1. With the CERB, by contrast, initially, if you earned anything, the entire benefit disappeared, and then there was $1,000 earning. As soon as you earned $1,001, you lost the $2,000 benefit. So you'd be working for $1,001 and $999 less well off than if you weren't working at all. So that kind of barrier, that kind of trap in social programs is, I think, one thing that basic income is really well designed to overcome. And some social programs, in fact, most social programs are moving towards that kind of a gradual phase out of the program as earnings increase.
Yes, that's something we're working on too. You explained it really well in your book, and I actually borrowed. I think you gave the example of a daycare worker making minimum wage and why it wouldn't make sense for her to go back to work if she was on the CERB. And I thought that was so interesting, and because it talks about the welfare wall, and I hope that it makes people question the clawback rates within our current income. With the exception of AISH, the clawback rates in all the income support programs across Canada, I'd say, are too high.
Yeah, much too high.
Adjusted. Yeah,
much too
high. Can you talk a little bit about temporary foreign workers? I thought this was a really good question. How would a basic income, because I think a temporary foreign worker or a sponsored immigrant wouldn't qualify for income support in most provinces. So how do you envision a basic income impacting people with that kind of status, immigration status?
I think a temporary, I find the temporary foreign worker program a terribly exploitive program. It is a program that imports people, takes advantage of the lack of opportunities in other countries. It imports people to do jobs that Canadians won't do at wages and under circumstances that Canadians won't accept. In principle, they're covered by labor legislation, but in practice, it's almost impossible for them to access the protections that the law puts in place. So if you're asking me whether we should extend a basic income to temporary foreign workers, I think my answer would say we should do away with the temporary foreign worker program. I think if we're going to bring people to Canada, then we should ensure that they have access to, some kind of a path towards citizenship, if that's what they want. They should have access to the labor market on the same terms that Canadians have, and certainly immigrants and refugees should have access to a basic income on the same basis as other Canadians. So I mean, I think that it's not basic income is not a solution to everything. We still need to root out the inequities that exist, like the temporary foreign workers program. It's a terrible, terrible program.
Yeah, I think that's a good example that a basic income is just income, and there are other dimensions of poverty and inequality that need to be addressed. Just going back to the BC report, that was the version of a basic income that was rejected. It was a straw dog basic income that replaced all other programs, which is odd, and that no one's advocating for. I mean, we would all say no to a basic income such as that. So I was very disappointed that was the model they were using to reject it.
Yeah, it was sort of a lazy response. They also costed a model that's not under serious consideration, I think, in Canada as well.
Yeah, agreed. Can you speak to how a basic income would affect the social determinants of health? Because I think that's where your career started, and that's probably what got you going on basic income.
Absolutely. I'm a health economist, and I work, my office is actually at the Health Sciences Center, which is in downtown Winnipeg. And when you're a health economist in Canada, people ask you one question. They ask it in 1,500 different ways, but they ask the same question all the time. And that is, how are we going to pay for this system? Where are we going to get the money from to keep offering healthcare? We don't have enough money. It's, you know, the demand is growing, the population's aging. How are we going to pay for it? And then you walk through the hallways of the hospital and you go into the ED and you talk to patients and you talk to providers and you look at the people who are being treated in the clinics and you talk to them about the circumstances of their lives. And you don't actually need a PhD in health services research to recognize that you know, we're using our healthcare system to treat the consequences of poverty. The circumstances within which we live are driving the health that we experience. And some of it's obvious. I mean, we saw during the pandemic how quickly infectious diseases, for example, ripped through neighborhoods that are characterized by too many people in frontline low-wage jobs and overcrowded housing. I think the mental health consequences of trying to live with poverty in a high-income country like Canada are immense. I mean, the stress that people are living under, constant stress. But even the physical circumstances, even our physical health is determined by the circumstances within which we live. So actually, yeah, my first serious exposure to basic income happened probably about 15 years ago now, when I was trying to answer that question. And I remembered this old project that took place in Manitoba called Meaghon. And Meaghon offered some Manitoba families a basic income for a period of 3 years. And I thought, well, there must be data. I wonder if they were any healthier. And so I went in search of that data. And I finally found it, but I also was able to track some of the participants in that experiment in the health database, the Medicare database. And I was able to show that families, people who received a basic income, were 8.5% less likely to be hospitalized than people living in similar kinds of families with similar incomes in similar neighborhoods who didn't have a basic income. 8.5%. And then you start you start thinking about those numbers in your head and you realize that Canada's spending, $75 billion a year or more on hospitals. And you realize that those costs are showing up in our healthcare system. You think, is this a reasonable thing to do? I mean, is it reasonable to wait until people get sick and then to bring in all of the, heavy artillery, so to speak, to try to keep them alive after they've gotten sick? Or should we ensure that people have enough money to live in reasonable places and to have reasonable diets for their entire lives? And so that was really my first exposure, my first serious exposure to basic income. But if you think about a lot of other social programs we've got in place in Canada, they're all mopping up the effects of poverty. You think about criminal justice. 80% of women who are incarcerated are there for poverty-related crimes. 80%. It's expensive to keep people in prisons, and it's not only not just, it doesn't even make financial sense. If you think about child and family services, the greatest reason for kids being taken away from their parents is neglect. Well, it's really hard to tell the difference between neglect and poverty sometimes. Ensuring that families have those resources to keep their kids safe, to keep their kids healthy, it makes financial sense as well as compassionate sense.
Yeah, we found that the economic case sometimes resonates better with elected officials and leaders. So that is why in 2012, VCC, we did a cost of poverty report where we were able to calculate that poverty costs Alberta between $7.5 and $9 billion a year. And that was really just conservative estimate, tip of the iceberg. And, I know it's been many years since we've published that report, but we still reference it quite a bit, just to let people think critically about that. When they think a basic income is too expensive, we always bring up, so is the status quo, so is poverty. Yeah, absolutely.
They're costs we can't avoid. I mean, we're going to pay for poverty one way or another. Yeah. The question is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, prevention is cheaper than intervention, essentially. Okay. as part of my role at Basic Income Alberta, we've been meeting many MPs, MLAs, city councillors, just to try and have a dialogue about basic income. And we met with one minister, and he actually asked a good question. You know, he said, if basic income is so great, how come it hasn't been implemented yet? And I had to think if that was true, because I was like, wait, Spain is exploring it. Did Finland implement it after they had their pilot? I know. I found out no. And so it did make me think, like, and I wonder if you get this question, like, why doesn't a permanent program exist? And could it happen now?
I think, why doesn't it exist? I mean, I think if you think about the way bureaucracies operate, they're like these massive boats out there in the ocean, just heading in one direction. And I think it's really hard to shift course.
Yeah.
I think it takes a lot of courage for government to say, we are going to do something radically different. And, you know, governments have short mandates. And I think that that's a real challenge we face. I do think that we are moving towards basic income. We've talked about a number of examples that already exist in Canada, you know, small scale basic incomes. But I also note that there's an awful lot of grassroots support for the idea of basic income, and it's coming from so many different directions. The final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women has a guaranteed livable income as one of its calls to justice, a guaranteed livable income for all Canadians.
Yes.
As one of its calls to justice. You know, as I said, we've got labor advocates coming on board. Every time there's a poll, 70–80% of Canadians say this basic income thing seems to make a certain amount of sense. So there's a lot of pressure. If you think about federal political parties, you know, the Leah Gazan had a motion. The Liberals introduced a motion and just had second reading of the bill in Parliament.
Yes.
Which will die, of course, when Parliament rises for the summer. But I mean, it's there, and the discussion is there, and it's beginning. It's starting. The Green Party, the NDP, some support in the Liberals. There's been certainly some interest among Conservative members of Parliament at the federal level in a basic income as well. So I think people are starting to see the sense of this, that it's not a utopian fantasy. This is something that could happen. It's something that's feasible. The Parliamentary Budget Office did its costing studies, and, you know, the numbers are starting to look like something that could conceivably happen within Canada. And you think, well, you know, if this is something we should be thinking about, it's something, you know, we need to talk seriously about. Is it going to happen imminently? I don't see it happening within the next year or two, but I do think the pandemic has certainly awakened us to the possibilities that we can do a lot more than we have done in the past, and we can do things a lot better. And I had hoped at the beginning of the pandemic, I really hope that a lot of the people who found their lives improved by receiving the CERB and the CRB would keep that in mind when we start thinking about what happens afterwards. And I hope that that's true. I hope Canadians' eyes have been opened, and people have awakened to the fact that things can happen to you that you have no control over, that people aren't responsible necessarily for the circumstances within which they find themselves. And giving them a little bit of a boost, giving them an opportunity to build their lives back is a really important part of what it is we have to be doing.
Absolutely. And there's no going back. Now, I know of so many people that just learned about basic income in 2020 that never heard the term before, never knew what it was. And I'm sure that's the case for thousands of Canadians. So there's no going back, because Canadians know what a basic income is. Now they can envision a new possibility, and there's no going back from that. And I also want to bring up Tommy Douglas and universal healthcare. You know, did he get to see the benefits of healthcare before he left office? I wonder.
These are, you know, major social policy changes take time to implement. No question about it. I would love to see things happen more quickly than they do, but Medicare is a really good example. And I every time I think about basic income, and every time I get disappointed because things don't seem to be moving as quickly as I'd like them to move. I do remember Medicare, and I remember how hard people had to fight to bring this in. I remember the opposition, the concerted opposition to Medicare on the part of the establishment, the threats from physicians. All the doctors were going to leave Canada. They were going to refuse to practice, and the establishment was very much opposed. The insurance industry was very much opposed, and Medicare came about. I truly believe this because of a lot of white-haired ladies like me, a lot of people sitting in church basements, and a lot of very ordinary Canadians from all walks of life, from all kinds of backgrounds, saying this is just not fair. We're just not going to put up with it anymore. And they held the feet of their representatives to the fire. I mean, I think it was ordinary people that brought about change in Medicare. It was not led from the top. It was led from the grassroots. And I think that's what's going to happen with basic income. I think that, again, young people entering the workforce are facing such a different set of opportunities than I faced, and certainly than their parents, their grandparents faced. They're going to demand something better. And, I think that that's how we will bring about change. That's how we will bring about basic income.
How important is it that people meet with their own MPs and their own elected officials?
I think tremendously important. Go ahead. Sir.
I was just going to say that I decided to have a conversation with my MP about basic income because I was all fired up about Bill C-273, and I was like, man, I can't believe I haven't even asked my own MP about this. Like, does she even know what basic income is? And it took me about 3 or 4 months to finally get that 15-minute phone call with her. And I think her office tried to cancel the appointment with me about 10 times. I think she sent me an explanation of where she stands and, do you still want to have this meeting? And I said, yes, I do. And then I got another email because I'm really pretty sure where I stand on this. Yes, I do. And I've heard from friends and colleagues that they're going through the same thing. And I'm trying to tell them to keep at it, because if you could just get, face to face or on a phone call, then you could explain where you're coming from. And I just think that's so important.
I do think it's important. I think it's important for individuals to do it. And I also think it's important that we leverage all of the communities that we belong to. I was called by a couple of faith groups in Winnipeg. And as you may know, the United Church, the Anglicans have taken this on as an important aspect of what they're doing. We've gotten a lot of support from Muslim women, from various groups, and members of Parliament who aren't all that keen to meet with me are perfectly prepared to meet with representatives of faith groups, and they're perfectly prepared to meet with social clubs and with social organizations. So we need to leverage all of these organizations that we belong to. We need to make sure that it's part of our mandate to support the idea of basic income. So much of what we do, I think, is consistent with the idea of empowering individuals to make decisions about their own lives and ensuring that people have the resources they need. Basic income fits into that. And if it fits into that, it should be an explicit part of what it is we do. And everybody should be aware of that. Our members of Parliament should certainly be reminded on a regular basis that we're watching them. We know what they're doing. We know what they're voting. We know what they say in Parliament. And we're not going to forget that come the next election.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We're coming to the end of our advanced questions. I think I've asked them all, so maybe we should go ask Stephanie or Kurt. Do you guys see any questions rolling in that we haven't talked about yet? I see a ton of activity in the chat here. Oh, someone says, I feel anything less than $2,500 per month is below the bare minimum. This amount would be enough to pay rent, buy basic food, and pay for transit.
Yeah, and what's important with that is to remember how little people are receiving in most provinces from income assistance. So $2,500 is a substantial increase, a really substantial increase.
Absolutely. I did a graph of, because we've had incremental changes to our benefit rates in Alberta. They've gone up a little bit here and there over the last couple of decades. But when you actually compare it to the poverty line, you know, it doesn't even come close. And yet what's interesting is when you look at the regulation and the purpose of these programs, they actually say in the regulation, it is intended to provide for food, shelter, basic needs, medical expenses. And I'm like, these programs have never met their intended purpose. You know, they're not even meeting their own policy goals, and no one's really calling them on this because it's welfare. And it boggles my mind that they seem to be perfectly content with continuing along, running these programs so far below adequacy, and yet claiming that they are intended to meet basic needs, I think is what's very frustrating. Hi, Colleen. Oh, Megan's asking me a question here. Oh, there are some questions here. Does it make sense to have different amounts of basic income in different provinces based on the cost of living in different locations? What are your thoughts on this, Evelyn?
I think that's, I mean, it's undeniably true that if you're living in Vancouver and Toronto, you face housing costs that are very different from living in Moose Jaw or Winnipeg. And, you know, if you live in Northern Canada, your costs of living are much higher than if you live in the South. At the same time, if we look at some of our most successful programs, they don't necessarily adjust those programs for local conditions. So OAS pays the same amount of money no matter where in the country you live. AISH pays the same amount of money no matter where in Alberta you live. Mm-hmm. And the way I see, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that we need to recognize differences in different parts of the country, but I can see that happening through parallel programs. So if we were to have a national basic income, for example, provinces would certainly be free to top up the amount to deal with local circumstances. Municipalities would be free to top up the amount to deal with local circumstances. So, I mean, I think that that's one way of dealing with it. The other way of dealing with it is that if it's provincial led, if the provinces design their own basic income, mm-hmm. There could certainly be some variation between provinces.
One of the criticisms is that delivering a basic income through the tax system, I think that's the ideal way, is nationally through the tax system. But our tax mm-hmm. system, couple of issues, it's not responsive enough to how income changes throughout the year. And not everyone files their taxes. Like, what are your thoughts on like automatic tax filing?
Well, I think automatic tax filing is a really important thing because many of our benefits are delivered through the tax system. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's another thing we learned during the pandemic. You know, the CERB was based to a very large extent on self-reports of income. So it was a very simple, user-friendly approach. I mean, an online, easy to access system. If you didn't have access to internet, there were people to help you through the process. You could simply report your income every month and receive a basic income based on self-reports. Reconciliation, you know, to ensure that the amount you reported is actually valid, could happen once or twice a year rather than every month as it happens under current income assistance. And that has certain benefits. If you did that, that has certain benefits. One of the difficulties with income assistance for people who work, sometimes people work part-time, they get very variable income. And so every month, the amount of money they receive from provincial income assistance will vary as well. And so that just increases the volatility of what it is they're living with. To have a guarantee for 2 or 3 months, to be able to report your income and to know exactly how much you receive would allow people to make plans going forward. And ultimately, I mean, if it turns out that you received an overpayment, we don't have to treat it as a debt the way we do under current welfare programs, for example. It can simply adjust the amount going forward to reconcile. So I think that we've learned a lot, quite unintentionally, I think, with the CERB. We've learned a lot about how we can have a responsive system. We certainly can't base income assistance. We certainly can't base a basic income that replaces income assistance on last year's tax returns. It has to be responsive to what's happening in people's lives. But now we know we can do that.
That's so interesting. I would love to see a report from the CRA as to how this actually panned out? Because you hear lots of rumors, of people defrauding it and reporting incorrect income. So I'd like to know, did that really pan out?
Well, I'm sure that there are inconsistencies and errors at the end of the year, which would sort out. But as I said, those differences can be taken into account going forward. It's easy enough to fix those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, in my experience, people with low incomes tend to be tremendously honest in their reports, because the consequences of not being honest for them are profound.
Yeah.
There's a little statistic that I love to use, and people never believe it, but it's obviously true. And that is that the Canadian government loses more through tax fraud every year than the cost of delivering all of the income support programs offered by the provinces. We lose more in tax fraud than the entire cost of delivering income assistance.
Really?
Every year. So, I mean, and, the people who are involved in tax fraud are not, for the most part, minimum wage earners. Certainly the money lost in tax fraud are high income earners. A great deal of our income tax system is based on trust, but that trust is extended to high income earners, not to low income earners, who we police profoundly.
And the policing isn't based on any logic.
Nope.
It's an opinion.
It's just a belief.
Yeah.
Yep. It's just a belief that if you're living in poverty, there must be something wrong with you.
Yep.
You must be somebody who needs to be surveilled. And the reality is, I mean, I can give an example from my own tax history. I sold a rental property and made a capital gains on it. And I was so terrified of being called in by the CRA and going through a big audit. I tried to figure out how it was. So I had the property evaluated, and I had a stack of documentation like that to justify the capital gain I made on it. And I filled out my income tax, and there's one little line on the income tax. It says, state the capital gain you earned. They trusted me absolutely to state it. No one ever asked to see any of the evidence I'd amassed. Well, if you think about capital gains, I mean, there's an awful lot of money in capital gains taxation.
It's not taxed the same way as employment earnings, from what I understand.
Absolutely not. It's taxed at half the level of labor earnings.
Interesting. I think that's a recommendation in that report that you were one of the authors, the Royal Society of Academics, Recovery from COVID-19. I feel like there was an explanation about that in there. I found that very interesting, about how much revenue the government could gain from if they taxed capital gains as they taxed employment.
Absolutely. Capital gains and dividends. Investment income is certainly taxed at preferential rates relative to labor income, relative to other sources of income. So there are a lot of sources of income that we can find, a lot of sources of tax revenue that could support this kind of a program.
So interesting. What are your thoughts on the Canadian disability benefit?
I've been in a little bit of contact with disability advocates who've been working on what this program should look like. I think it's a very exciting set of opportunities, and certainly they would like to build into it some of the best features of a basic income, I think. So I think that's a great opportunity.
Based on the principles of a BI, you could even say. Yeah. This is another question we get. So we know there's proven evidence that a basic income produces better health outcomes. But is there any evidence on the cost savings to our healthcare system?
No,
anything like that?
There is a study underway at the University of Saskatchewan that's looking at downstream savings in various social programs. So hopefully we will have that data, but no.
Because that is a question that we get quite often. And I have a phone call with MP Michelle Rumpel shortly after this, and she's the health critic. So I would really like to give her some numbers, but I'll tell her they're coming. And as soon as we get them, I'll send them off to her, because that is a question we get. And again, that's the economic case, right? It resonates. It's if we can show that, we can not only improve people's lives and reduce poverty, but we can also save some money from our healthcare system. It just,
I think if you look at things like healthcare spending, what you're looking at is, this sort of runaway expenditure that's increasing exponentially over the years. What a basic income will do, it's not so much that it will generate cash that can be used to pay for a basic income, but it will slow the rate of growth, I think, of costs in the healthcare system and in other social programs.
Absolutely. Justice, I think, is a big one.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well. Yeah. I feel like there's more openness to systemic change, like talking about just recovery overall. I don't know. And there's so many people engaged, and they want to talk about systemic change on a level that I've never seen, or maybe that's just the world I live in. But yeah, it's kind of exciting.
I hope that that's true. I hope people remember when everything opens up and we go back to something resembling our normal lives. I hope people remember what we learned during this hiatus, during this opportunity.
A crisis is a terrible thing to waste, is what I've heard. Okay, here's another good question about inflation, because I've heard this a couple of times. People are worried about rising inflation because of a basic income.
Yeah. I don't think a basic income will cause inflation. We're not increasing the amount of money in circulation. It is really a redistribution. Really, to a large extent, what we're doing is we're taking money that we already spend to transfer cash to people with low incomes, and we're trying to spend it better. And if you're spending the same amount of money, there's no more money in circulation. Now, that doesn't mean no prices will ever increase. I mean, if you look at a particular low-income neighborhood and suddenly people have more money to spend, local businesses are going to benefit. People are going to be buying things. Mm-hmm. So some local prices might increase, but I think we're not going to end up with runaway inflation because we're not borrowing money to do this. We can do this within the capacity of the existing system.
Is that what we're seeing with the CERB? Because I've heard that the CERB is to blame for rising food prices and lumber and a few
No, I mean, all those prices are going up, but they're going up because of all kinds of different things. They're going up because of, backlogs in the supply chains and interruptions in the supply chains, and, food is not being delivered to the same extent that it was before. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are happening internationally. It's not because a few people have a few more dollars to spend. And in fact, most of the people who received the CERB would have had an income in any case. So, no, I don't think the CERB is driving those prices at all.
Thanks for explaining that. Okay, let's talk about the Liberals as we end. They passed several basic income resolutions at their convention, and I've heard that they've done this in the past, but this time it's different. I think if we have it wasn't mentioned in the throne speech, but what's there's certainly a few Liberals that are very interested in basic income, but what are your thoughts? What are the chances of the Liberals actually taking this on?
I think that there are a lot of Liberals who are interested in this, as I think there are members in all parties who are interested in the idea of basic income. I don't know. Do I expect to see it in the next, here's a good question. Can we expect to see this as an election issue? If there's an election come the fall, will this be an election issue? The NDP believes it will be. At least some members of the NDP believe it will be. I don't know. I think that that's something to watch going forward. I do know that the Premier of PEI has had a conversation with Trudeau about using PEI as a test site for basic income. I don't know what the nature of that conversation was, but I do know that they talked. I do know that there's a lot of interest in Newfoundland in
Yes.
doing something in cooperation with the federal government as well. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of provinces who are pushing. I think that we are now in a situation, if you look at the fiscal state of the provinces in this country, most of the provinces are very close to bankruptcy. So something is going to have to happen. I mean, somehow money is going to have to be transferred from the federal government to the provinces, or they'll have to take over some provincial responsibilities. So I think that there are opportunities. But you're asking me if the Liberals have the courage to move forward on this, and I can't answer that. I don't know.
Yeah,
I know that people who vote Liberal, many people who vote Liberal, are disappointed in the lack of courage, I think, in some areas. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thank you for that. What's your opinion on symbolic basic income resolutions from municipal governments?
You know what? I take support wherever it comes, and I think you know, one of the interesting things that's happened over the past year is that virtually every major city in the U.S. is running a basic income pilot. These are not likely to be permanent. These can't be permanent policy changes because in almost all cases they're being funded by foundations. It's temporary money. And they're very, very small pilots. So, you know, you'll choose 200 single mothers, or you'll do this for a particular neighborhood of a city. But they're all running pilots. And they're doing that, I think, at least in part because they're trying to change attitudes. They're trying to change attitudes of the public, and they're trying to light a fire under state governments and under the federal government. So I don't discount what municipalities do. I think municipalities can and should play a larger role going forward. And so I think that that's a very positive thing.
Thank you. We have an election coming up for Edmonton and Calgary in October. So we're thinking about that, you know, because we might have a new council. We've approached our council in the past and they weren't really feeling it, but things might be different. And yeah, I've certainly changed my mind. I was reading the Kingston motion. I think Kingston was the first municipality in Canada to have one. And I think that really made a difference with getting the Ontario pilot going. So, yeah. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. Stephanie or Kurt, do you guys have any instructions for participants before we end? Well, I'm not hearing anything. Thank you so much, Evelyn. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. Oh, and then Stephanie says participants can join the other sessions after this, after you take a break, of course, and replenish your coffee. We look forward to your TED Talk, Evelyn. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lee, and thanks everyone for getting up so early and listening, joining us today.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.